Okay, so we'll begin. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a UK energy market introductory event. Some of you may be aware the UK is an energy giant and a world leader in urging businesses and investors, cities and regions around the world to commit to reaching to net zero by 2050. This year, the UK will also be hosting the UN's Climate Change Forum, which is called the COP26 in Glasgow. Hopefully, it'll be physical. Registration of interest for organizations to take part in COP is now open. For more details, check out the link in the chat box that I'm going to put there in a minute now. This event will try to provide a bird's eye view as well as a deep dive into the UK energy market. You would hear also about the excellent funding opportunity for UK-Israel collaboration around energy research and innovation called the World Clean Growth Fund. This event is a collaboration between the British Embassy in Israel, the British Council in Israel, and Ignite the Spark. My name is Hadar Huberman, and I work in a very special team based at the British Embassy in Tel Aviv called the UK-Israel Tech Hub. My team's mission is to work with UK's largest corporates and to find them with the best, most disruptive technologies in Israel, which will answer their pressing needs and aches and sorrow. We've been operating for a decade already, facilitated over 200 corporate to startup tech partnerships. And the past year, I've been leading the clean tech sector in my team, which includes, of course, the energy tech. Before I'll introduce you to the first speaker of today, I'd like to let my dear partner, Ashel Lickman from Ignite the Spark, tell about the organization and invite you to our main event happening in 2 weeks. Ashel.
Hey, Adar, thank you. I think it's a great opportunity to thank you for all of the really hard effort that you put into this event and the next one. My name is Ashel Lickman, the co-founder of Ignite the Spark. We are the Israeli energy tech innovation community, which I bet most of you already know. We are lucky to be hosting not only this event, and thank you, Ariel and Jonathan, for joining, but also a really big event in 2 weeks, which should be some sort of an online energy festival. We're going to celebrate and talk about energy innovation, many different kinds. We have specifically a keynote given by the host of the Fully Charged show, and additionally another 3 roundtables. One is dealing with innovation in academia, the other one is the role of regulation in unbundling markets, and it's extremely interesting after what's happened in Texas last week. And the last one is innovation and the lesson learned by startups in growth phase. So I hope you all going to join, and I hope you're all going to learn a lot, both on that event, but specifically today, because for many Israelis, this intro event can be a really good place to start if you want to understand how unbundled market works. So Adar, thank you very much. Jonathan and Ariel, good luck, and hope to see you soon, maybe face to face.
Thank you, Ashel. All right. So before I introduce you to the first speaker of today, I'd like to say that you'll have the option to register to the main event in 2 weeks. I'll put the link for the Eventbrite in the chat box. So stay tuned. And let's begin with a short presentation by my colleague, Mr. Ariel Retik from the British Council in Israel. Ariel is responsible for projects that enable collaboration in higher education and research between the UK and Israel, and is leading on the Wall Alliance program, which you will hear about now. We will also have time for questions if you stay until the last 10 to 15 minutes after Jonathan Tudor also speak. But I encourage you to write the questions, which will pop up as they come in the chat box. Ariel, I'm going to pin you so that everybody can see you. Thank you. Go ahead.
I'll mute myself. Okay. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, and you can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Hadar, for the introduction. I'll keep this as quite a brief presentation I'll talk about the Wall Clean Growth Alliance project, which is a newly launched project and part of what sort of instigated this meeting and the event that we have in 2 weeks. The Wall Clean Growth Alliance project, as I mentioned, is funded by the Wall Legacy Foundation in London and is operated here by the British Council in Israel and the UK Science and Innovation Network, and also the Israel Ministry of Science and Technology is on board as a collaborator. The aim of the project is to bring together researchers and those involved in the research ecosystem to form and enhance collaborations in fields of clean growth, specifically as they relate to water, food, and what's relevant here, energy. What does that mean in practice? In practice, it means that we have a grant scheme that aims, it's a small grant scheme that aims to help at any stage of collaboration of clean energy research. And I should also mention here, of course, that when we say clean energy, we mean anything from the generation of energy, the storage of energy, distribution, including the politics of clean energy. And this funding is quite flexible. It is, again, built around research, but at any stage of the process. And the most relevant stage here is probably the application of research from academia into industry, or the communication of research, research policy, or the sort of application of new policy around new technologies and new companies. All applications must have one UK, one Israeli partners, and the organization receiving the grant must be a university or research institution in the UK or Israel. But that organization is then free, of course, to use the money as it sees fit. And the projects, this doesn't, again, I'm stressing that this isn't about academic collaborations. This is about collaborations between academia as well as industry at any level and at any stage, policymakers, think tanks, third sector organizations, and so forth. I won't go into the admissible cost because this is indicative. It's just to show you an example of the sorts of things that we can fund. But I'll more stress here that what we can't fund is things like the direct research costs. So this isn't a research program. Of course, the grants are not of a suitable scale. This is for the things around research that make collaboration possible. Other things we can do is, if you have any ideas relating to clean growth and to energy, we can host meetings, we can sponsor meetings, we can help put together other events. Come to us for ideas. If you have ideas that you think fit in within this theme, within what you see are our aims, then come and speak to us and we can see how we can collaborate to make them possible. I'll leave it at that. There's a link here. I think we'll put it into the chat as well. Do have a look. Do get in touch. Do come to us with ideas. We're happy to discuss and see how we can make them work. So with that, I think that if we wait for questions, any questions at the end?
Yes. Thank you, Ariel. For this intro to this amazing program. It's important to mention, I don't know if it was mentioned, that the program is also available for research and innovation collaboration also around food and water, in addition to energy. So if you hear about other companies that you know of that might be interested in applying for such an initiative, please do connect them to this program. I'm going to introduce you to Jonathan Tudor, but before that, the embassy, I would like you to know that the embassy will support your search for a UK partner for the Wall Alliance program. When you register for our coming energy event, you'll have a list of questions which will allow us to direct you to the relevant UK research body. So please do apply and answer the questions, and we'll connect you to the relevant body in the UK. And to our main session of the day, please let me introduce you to Mr. Jonathan Tudor. Jonathan is a longtime partner of the Embassy and is today the investment partner at the Clean Growth Fund, a public-private UK fund which invests in companies and products and services focused on driving clean growth in a low-carbon economy. Jonathan has over 20 years of venture investment experience across multiple sectors, geographies, and markets. He has led investment teams in BP Ventures and most recently at Centrica. He has spent the last 8 years focused on energy-related early-stage investment in Europe, the US, and Israel. Jonathan, without further ado, go ahead.
Thank you, Hedda. You saved me doing my introduction about what I'm going to do, so I can spend more time talking about the energy bit. So forgive me, guys. I'm pretty geeky about this. I'll start showing a screen in a second, but what I wanted to focus on, I think for entrepreneurs and founders, wherever they are, actually, the whole energy transition is a huge opportunity for people to create new business models, and apply existing tech to solve some problems which is going to really get pretty profound. Ashil already mentioned like what's happened in Texas in the last kind of week, where they've had all that snow and the demands that's created on the network and all the power outages, right? I think that's set to continue, especially as more and more renewable energy starts to come onto all the various grid networks around the world. So I was going to talk a little bit about what's happened in the UK, because the energy market's structured very differently here to it is in Israel, and there are a few other places in the world which are very similar to the UK. And then talk through how that transition happened commercially, and then what's the impact of now with the race to net zero and carbon emissions, etc. So let me do that. So hopefully you can start seeing my screen. So what I was really going to talk about is not just where we are and how our market's structured, but what kind of venturable opportunities does that transition create for everybody. A little bit about us as a fund. So we're an early stage. We'll do late stage seed, Series A, a little bit of Series B in climate tech, predominantly around energy. We created the fund. It's a relatively new fund. We only had our first closing back in May. We only invest in the UK at the moment, unfortunately, and until we've got more capital in the fund, we're still fundraising ourselves. So we're unusual, as Adar said, that we're public and private funds. So this is the first time the British government have done this, that they've committed £20 million to the fund, and they sit on exactly the same terms as the other financial investors in the fund, where we have another 20 million. So we're already investing, and we're still trying to fundraise for the fund, getting it up to sort of 150 million pounds, hopefully by the end of this year. And there's a question then whether we'll be able to extend our reach across the rest of Europe, hopefully into Israel again, where I've done a number of investments in this space over the last few years. Now, when we talk about energy from the fund's perspective, we look at all those 5 sectors you can see on the screen. Most notably, I think the opportunities for energy tech are in the power, transport, and buildings spaces. Power, not just on how you create energy and power from renewables and solar and heat and power storage, the smart grids, etc. But obviously around electrification of vehicles is happening a lot. And vehicles isn't just cars, that's buses, that's trucks, that's the on-road drones, the autonomous vehicles that will be doing parcel deliveries, which trials are happening now. But equally on buildings, you should, from an energy perspective, you should not look at these any differently than a battery, right? They're big consumers of and absorbers of excess power, but equally they have great flexibility into the amount of energy power they're consuming at any point in time, and have a role to play in the energy transition for that. But let me go back, explain. We've already somebody mentioned about the unbundling of the energy system. That's already happened in the UK. That started way back in the late 80s. So through the 1990s, it transitioned. So prior to that, the government controlled pretty much all the generation, the distribution of how that and the transmission of all that power and energy got into people's homes, how that got into factories, etc. It was overseen by one electricity council, and likewise a similar sort of picture for the gas heating networks. There was a central government council over it, broken down into regions. So the UK had 12 regionally government controlled businesses which were responsible for billing, the distribution and the performance. And then on the generation side, all the nuclear, coal generation capacity we had, as well as the grid network owned by National Grid now, again, was all government owned, government controlled. That was deregulated or liberalized. You'll often hear it written about, started back in the late 1980s until today, where that's been broken up. And so generation is owned by a group of companies which are legally not allowed to own the national grid for competition reasons. And the transmission network, how it gets from those generators through to your home, through to factories, is owned primarily by the UK. It's just really National Grid that operates, but they're regulated by the Ofgem, which is the Office of Generation and Energy Management. And then further down the line, once it gets from those big transmission grid systems, it gets to what I put on the screen as DNOs, or the distribution network operators. They're responsible for maintaining the lower voltage substations you'll see, and you'll have those in Israel as well, and the transmission back to your home or into a factory. So they're broken up down into 14 regional distribution network operators. Those are owned by 8 different companies. Some of those are, one of the biggest in the world is an Italian company called Enel. They own part of the UK DNOs. And then from the DNOs, that goes then into the energy suppliers. So when my company back in the UK, I used to work for Centrica owned British Gas, which supplied electricity and gas to consumers and factories and commercial companies. So there's about 55 active suppliers across the UK now who do essentially just billing machines. They will trade in energy. They will purchase and acquire pricing at wholesale prices. They'll trade that volume, and then they'll break up that supply into multiple different contracts back to consumers and factories and the like. But those suppliers cannot legally own the distribution network, and they can't have rights in the transmission. Nor can they in the generation, unless there's some big Chinese walls within the companies, all driven by deregulation, by competition. And all of these now, those different sectors, whether generation, transmission, distribution, and the billing, are all commercial organizations with no government ownership, no government control. So a number of other countries around the world are in the start of doing this now. So Japan is the latest country which is in that journey of liberalizing or debundling, unbundling how the energy market works. The rest of Europe is in the same position now, but the UK kind of led that within Europe. If you look to the States, it varies by state. There are a number of states which are unbundled, Texas being one of them. California is still state controlled, and through various different companies. But it's probably one pathway that this is happening. Most countries are looking at this now to bring in the private sector to help with the energy transition. But this is driving a lot of what the government policy is happening in the UK and around the world. Is if you look at, there's a general decline in the amount of fossil fuel that is burnt and used to create that power on the network. Again, that you can just see the snapshot for the UK here, that is a general decline in the amount of fossil fuels, whether that's natural gas, coal, or waste that we're burning, as opposed to the amount of nuclear and the renewables is gradually increasing over, and has been and will continue to do so over the next couple of years. But as you know about, we're famous for our weather in Britain, right? And it's very unpredictable. It's not usually very pleasant. not like the sun you get in Israel. So if you look at that chart, that's basically just saying and reflecting that it isn't predictable. If you look at how the amount of solar we had in Q3 2019 versus Q3 2020, it's largely reflects what the weather was like at the time, and so it's largely unpredictable. So as the whole energy market here transitions from this centralized generation, whether that's burning coal, whether that's burning gas to generate power, to more wind or solar or other forms of renewable energy, it creates new problems and challenges that the private market and predominantly startups have actually helped solve and mitigate this unpredictable nature of power generation. So if you think about weather, particularly here, we get a lot of wind off the shore and the coast in the UK, which is why we have, you know, a lot of offshore wind. But it typically is blowing. It's windier at 3 a.m. in the morning when nobody needs that power. Very few of the factories are running. People aren't cooking. People aren't watching TV as much at that time of the day. So what do you do with that excess power? At the moment, we've got this crazy situation that on certain days, if it's really, really windy, the wind operators will be paid to turn off the wind turbines, rather than we just maximize and take that energy and store it somewhere. So part of that change in the energy transition, the opportunities are, or if you like, the problem statement is, what do we do with that excess renewable power and energy? When we generate it, we ought to harvest it, make use of it, store it. Likewise, the counter of that is, if it isn't windy or if it isn't sunny and there's a demand for greater amount of energy and power, what do we do on the network to avoid having to suddenly fire up what do they call a peaker plant, or a plant that just meets peak demand, where they would traditionally burn gas or hydrocarbons or polluting materials just to create that or meet the demand. Is what can we do that make the network more intelligent, smarter, that we can push energy back into the grid to balance the supply and demand. And this balancing of supply and demand is becoming more of a challenge. So you'll have people, you know, sit in front of multiple screens like that, monitoring the network, its performance, predicting at a half-hourly or hourly basis, what is the demand going to be? Have we got enough power generation on the network? Is the frequency of the power that's coming onto the grid stable enough? And they have to manage that pretty tightly, actually, because we're AC currents here, so the amount of power we're getting is oscillating, and if there's too much power coming onto the grid, the rate at which the hertz of that power actually tends to increase, and then likewise, if there's not enough power coming onto the network, that voltage fluctuation the frequency can decrease. And when we've got all these, you know, TVs, computers, and all the systems which are set up here to run at 240 volts and 50 hertz, is, you know, so dependent on that frequency, it can actually start to damage machines if they don't manage it. So managing the grid and balancing the supply and demand has always been a challenge. It only gets more difficult as more and more renewables come on the market, because it's more difficult to predict. It's not so controllable. It's harder to configure. So at the moment, it's kind of driven a whole swathe of small technology companies which are helping to manage the effectiveness of how you optimize renewables onto the power network. So that is now that, if you think back to the diagram I had a couple of slides back, where I spoke about how, you know, the UK is unbundled you know, generation, transmission, distribution back to homes and factories. It was that top line, that linear line owned by the government, controlled by the government. And it was a very centralized process, right? There'd be these centralized big power plants linked then to the big transmission networks. You see, they went down to these smaller number of distribution centers, which would then go on and push that power down to people's homes. that bottom half of that slide is just saying, well, the world's changing, right? There's a power plant, and that can be a renewable piece, that could be wind, for example, or a nuclear power plant. We still need that transmission, but we're starting to insert at that point now this active network management again, that says, well, actually, when we look at what's on the grid, there's batteries now which can store the excess energy. So if it is 3 a.m. and the wind's blowing in the North Sea and we're generating all this offshore wind and power, let's make use of it. Rather than pay the wind operators to stop the wind turbines generating, let's pay them for the energy and the power they're producing, but let's store it. Equally, in those buildings, they have batteries inside buildings now, rather than just grid side storage. People's homes tend to have storage if you look on the right hand side, right? And so if they're generating local solar energy off their rooftop, it used to get just pushed back to the grid and help meet local supply and demand. Now that people are starting to get more sophisticated and saying, well, actually, if I'm generating solar during the day and energy, but I'm not home, I want to store it so I can use it myself in the evening when I get back. And then likewise, that CHP in the middle there that I put next to the building, that's combined heat and power. So there's units where you can, if you need to produce heat at the moment and you're going to be burning, it could be hydrogen, it could be natural gas, you can use combined fuel cells to produce a little bit of electrical energy as well as heat energy to heat and power your own homes, or indeed bigger buildings. Those are all linked to the distribution system now. So inherently here, this is getting way more complicated. The nature of the demand, so electric vehicles increasingly coming onto the network, are all going to increase the amount of electrical load that is going to be required for this to meet demand. It needs this active network management, and that is increasingly data driven. That's increasingly needing to be predictive. It increasingly starting to build its own models. It's machine learning. It's a lot of artificial intelligence applied to do the reinforcement learning of what typically happens when the weather pattern is going to be doing this, what's predicting what the renewable output is going to be. Therefore, how much energy do I need and power do I need to have stored to meet the demand over the next couple of days? When do I think the peak price is going to be for power and energy? So when do I need to release that energy back off the network? Can I get paid if I run a big compressor, or if I'm running a shopping center or an airport, I'm a big consumer of power and energy? Are there assets that I own that I could, turn off for a period of time? So turn the aircon down for half an hour. It's going to make hardly any noticeable difference to the building and the people inside it, but I can get paid to help balance and or help the grid meet supply and demand. So the way that the market generates income, creates opportunities, just to maximize the amount of renewable power come to market, is creating huge amounts of opportunities for smarter, more digital network, and a network which isn't so reliant on these single big centralized power stations and then transmission stations. It's going to be a complete mixture of larger power production, offshore wind, onshore wind, big solar farms, micro producers such as individual consumers in their homes, where they'll have smaller solar arrays and smaller storage. It is starting to be connected already, but it needs to be optimized. And that digital interface to how we optimize that is still in the process of being built. So part of that, if you look on the slide, there's some probably names you may recognize: the Centrica, EDF, Aon. I mean, they're the large companies with Engie in France. They were the traditional energy companies. I worked for Centrica, for example. To a large extent, some of those own some generation assets. A lot of them will supply directly to consumers power and energy, but they grew out of old companies, and so they've got heavy legacy IT systems Centrica was one of the largest procurers of SAP, for example, whereas if you're a newer upstart, and the company I put there is OVO Energy is one of the examples of those companies in the UK. They could see how this energy transition was happening, that the way that it was unbundled created opportunities to disrupt and say, well, actually, I can build a system, a billing platform that isn't dependent on SAP. It can be completely cloud native. And so they have a different cost point of view and had the opportunity to design and build a software product which only served the energy customers as a piece. It did so it started to have a margin advantage over the larger incumbents. And then you started to see, if you move to the right of that screen, all these companies are the ones that are starting to participate in that digital intervention of how you manage and control the power on the network. So all of these companies actually have that ability and are regulated and are authorized to respond to supply and demand and participate into supply and demand. And they may control battery assets. They may link, like in the case of Flexitricity, if I own 10,000 individual electric vehicle chargers, which are people's homes, I can aggregate those up and I can put their presence onto the Flexitricity platform, so that when the market says, hey, look, there's not enough solar power at the moment and there's not much wind around, everybody's charging their cars. Can anybody give us a break and just push down or throttle down the rate at which you're charging your cars? That signal comes digitally from the national grid here. And then Flexitricity picks up that digital signal and then remotely and automatically can control all those 10,000 car chargers as needs be. And it may just take it down by 10, 20%. But as you aggregate all that up, that has a massive effect on the performance of the grid and may push down to say, well, actually, we don't need to start burning some hydrocarbons in the next hour or two just to meet that peak demand. So all the companies on the right-hand side of that chart are companies that, I think LimeJump has been acquired by Shell now. The other one, I think Upside, has recently been acquired. But the others are typically, they're still startup companies, privately held, venture backed businesses. But to be honest, I could have covered that whole screen in logos of startups, which are in the UK now and increasingly going across the rest of the world in providing these kind of grid level services to help mitigate the challenges and the opportunities resulting from the unbundling of what was government controlled generation, transmission, distribution through to completely privately owned and operated, but government overseen. And with the increasing renewables on here, it's created all these opportunities for founders and entrepreneurs to start tackling some of those problems. Now, the one thing I just worth speaking about a little bit about consumers in the home, because this is another part of what resulted the government unbundling, was you used to just have very old analog meters for your gas and electricity at home, and then every 3-4 months somebody would come by with a piece of paper and knock on the door and ask to read your meters, right? The UK, that doesn't happen now. It's government mandated. It was that by the end of this year, but COVID's kind of pushed that back, is that there needed to be 53 million digital smart meters installed in people's homes by the end of this year, at the cost of the energy industry, not to the individual consumer. And these are sensors that sit in your home and just monitor how much energy and or electricity and gas that you're consuming. It'll give you an indication of whether are you being as efficient as you could be as a consumer. But the main part here is that it's gathering data every 30 minutes and then transmitting it automatically back to your energy company. It doesn't mean that you're now getting billed on a half-hourly basis. It just means that the energy companies are getting much greater granularity on what's going on in people's homes. You're getting more accurate bills, but it creates this huge data lake of data about the individual patterns of how people are consuming and where. So I just want to speak a little bit about that, because I think that's where we expect, from our fund's perspective as well, a lot of opportunities to start arising in the next couple of years. But it's a pattern that's happening across Europe and in certain parts of the US, where these smart meters are being mandated or being adopted. And there's a whole data protection question about, well, who owns the data and who has access to it. So in the UK, this is how it works. So as a consumer, and this could even be a business, that you grant permission for somebody to access that meter data at your say so. That is centralized, that permission, and who controls that access is a government overseen group called DCC. They control the access to the data, and that could be to the energy supplier, that could be a service provider, or any number of service providers who say they can monetize the availability of that data. That can give, for example, if that consumer has solar and an electric vehicle, that would show up in your smart meter data, and they'd be able to see that pattern. That means that somebody may be able to come back and make a direct commercial proposition to you as consumer around how you want to charge your vehicle, a pricing around that, purchasing some of your energy, etc. It also provides a great opportunity for white goods manufacturers, whether that's your refrigerator or washing machine, for example. If the data there is on enough granularity, and soon there's talk about this, rather than going every 30 minutes collecting data, it'll go to every 10 seconds and collecting data. You start to see these very, very granular analysis of not just the amount of power that's going through the home, but the amount of power going through individual devices within the home. That signature, that pattern of the amount of energy that your washing machine is pulling can be indicative of the state of health of the washing machine, and predictive maintenance systems being able to predict that your washing machine's about to break. All can come from analysis of the type of data of the amount of energy that's going through the home. But likewise, the same in big industry is a sawmill that you've got, or a big machine that you're operating. If it's suddenly drawing a lot more energy than it used to, is that an indication that that's about to break? Right? Now, whereas those used to be able to get that information inside the factory or the unit, now that it's having to pass through these smart meters and it's much more digital, you don't have to deploy so many sensors and devices within inside homes, inside factories, to get the same level of data and insight as to what's going on. So the real question that we're asking founders and entrepreneurs is, actually, given the amount of data that is now available, what are the new business models, what are the new business opportunities, or what are the new products and services that could be built on top of this? Now, having come from an energy company myself when I was at Centrica, it's really tough for them to ask questions, because they're not in that kind of frame of mind. They know how to make money because that's what they've done for years. And it's really difficult for them to just look and say, well, we've got all this data, how do we monetize it? They don't necessarily ask themselves the right type of questions to think about what are the new services and propositions that we could do with that. I suppose a lot of that was around electricity, but in the UK, a third, so 33% of the emissions we make in the UK are down to heating and burning gas just to keep warm. And the government here has already made a legislation that says within the next 4 years, if you build a new house, you will not be allowed to connect to the gas grid to heat it. So that picture on the screen, that is, it's a heat pump. It's exactly the same principle as air conditioning, but rather than extracting the heat out of your room and pushing it outside your house, it does the exact opposite. It extracts heat from the air outside and then pumps it back inside the house. You can also have these where they bury the heat exchange coils into the ground and extract the heat from what's in the soil and put it back into homes. That's all been made possible because the building standards and regulations about insulation on new properties means their homes are way more efficient than they were 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. The big challenge we have in the UK is 90% of our homes were built many years ago, and so then it's really difficult to insulate them and to use these type of new tech to keep them warm. So the question is, what are we going to be doing as a nation? And government is starting to do some subsidies and incentivizations here to do that retrofit and come up with those new challenges. One of those will be around hydrogen, right? And you're increasingly seeing this now in the media and discussion. Europe is trying to take a leadership position on hydrogen. And people say, when will it be ready? That picture there is of a company called Worcester Bosch. They're the main manufacturer of domestic boilers, heating units in the UK. They've already got a boiler that will run on, and it's configured to run on either natural gas or hydrogen, or a mixture of the two. They cost no more than existing boilers cost today to run. The question is, when will the rest of the grid be able to take it? And it's not just as simple as taking the pipelines and switching off natural gas and pushing in hydrogen. Hydrogen is obviously a very different gas to what you get out of the North Sea, in terms of how it combusts, how it burns, the amount of energy you get from it, the pressure it has to operate at. So there's a lot of infrastructure and capital changes which have got to happen, which the private sector is now starting to tackle. I think the UK last week, we announced that there's going to be a trial city or town established which will only run on hydrogen for heating, up and running in the next within the next couple of years. So that's a transition that we're all waiting to see what will happen. And the question for us as an investor is, what founders will they come up with? How can you generate hydrogen cost effectively, right? So that comes on to this. I think there's a whole question and theme around what needs to happen, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's replacement for heating, or whether it's what are the new opportunities for electrical storage and the operation of the electricity grid system. It's not a question of new tech. So like the heat pumps, batteries are known, solar's known, wind's known, etc. It's more about what are the new business models, and it's more around, I think, and what we're looking for a fund is there's an opportunity here to create new business models around how do you enable it. A consumer whose heating boiler breaks, and the engineer says you need to have a whole new boiler, and it's going to be £5,000 to have one fitted and installed, etc. Today, so they could say, look, if you want to go completely green and not have a burned gas, and you want to have a heat pump plus some solar and a battery, rather than being £4,000 or £5,000, it's going to be closer to £15,000 to £20,000. It's just simply not economic for a consumer to do that. The vast majority of people don't have that amount of capital to deploy to go green. So what is that new business model, so that the engineer can say, actually, it's £5,000 if you want a gas boiler, but if you want to go and do green, it's nothing, and it's a subscription model, and you pay this company £150 a month, and you don't need to worry about your bills, right? So everybody knows about software as a service. What about heating as a service, or coziness as a service, right? When people don't really understand what kilowatt hours are, don't really understand what British thermal units are, which is the measure of heat and energy. They just want to be comfortable in their homes. So what's that business model that enables that, where you're looking at a mixture of infrastructure investment, for example, and subscription agreements working together to deliver what's needed? That's, for me, is that there's a great number of opportunities now where people can bring prior experience and business models, just reapply it to solve what's needed to happen in the energy transition. So last couple of slides, I'm just going to give you an example of the two things that
we have a couple more minutes to finish the presentation and then go to Q&A.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, this is just example of the two investments we've done so far on the fund and why they fit into what we believe thesis. So the first one, it is a enterprise software, a market maker platform called Piccolo Energy. So on the left-hand side, you can see that map of the UK with the different icons, whether it's a wind generator, it could be solar, it could be somebody who's got a big power asset. what they will typically do is, if somebody who runs the distribution is distributing power, if demand increases in a certain area, they'll say, look, we need to invest 25 million pounds to upgrade our infrastructure. But unless somebody can, when we give you the digital signal, turn off some key bits of equipment or push some power back into the network. And so they said, we will pay you to turn things off. We will pay you to supply extra power. So what Piccolo does is the market maker platform between people who need that extra capacity, that flexibility, and the asset owners of that. Piccolo in the UK, it's probably got between 85 and 100% market share, depending on how you calculate it. It's just starting to expand outside of the UK into North America and on the continent. It's a great little software company that we invested in. The other one on the right-hand side, you'll recognize that's an electric vehicle charger. It was actually spun out of an energy company. And the reason we backed it is not really it's because of its hardware, it's because of the software that it sits behind that as well, which is integrated onto the platforms of Piccolo. It allows then remote signals and consumers to be paid to say, look, I know you've just plugged your car in at 6 p.m. and you want to charge it, but if you want to charge it more slowly and you can, or just not charge it till 3 a.m., we will pay you to do that, right? So people can actually start to monetize the presence of their EV charging, which further offsets the cost and the adoption of electric vehicles, which is a trend that we're likely to start seeing. Indra as well have a next, what we call the Horizon 2 opportunity in tech, which is if the grid had access to the battery in your car, in other words, that you could push power from your car back to your home, power your home for a period of time, you'd further mitigate all this impact of the renewables and help increase the flexibility in the energy market. That's probably a couple of years away, but they've got a technology that's already been deployed with Nissan, their electric vehicles over the last couple of years, which is the other reason why we backed it. I think that was my last slide, actually. Yeah, it was. So,
Right, so you can stop the screen share and we'll go to Q&A. So I have a few questions. First of all, thank you, Jonathan, for this fascinating overview of the UK market. I'm sure you've provided a lot of value for the viewers and for the people who will watch the recording. I have a few questions for the audience. First question is, can you tell a little bit about BIPV systems in the UK from regulatory and market points of view?
Sorry, which system, sorry?
BIPV, maybe I'm not reading it right. BIPV.
BIPV. Does somebody want to kind of elaborate on what?
Gary, do you want to elaborate about it?
Building integrated PV systems.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So there's so many acronyms in the industry, I get confused. So it's starting to happen in two ways. So if there is just solar installed on a building, at the moment, what happens in the vast majority of cases, it just gets pushed back into the grid, and there's a balancing mechanism with your supplier, or depending on how that solar installation was funded, it may be a condition of the funding is that you automatically push that back to the grid and you're paying a just different rate for your energy, and you're not compensated directly by how much you produce. What is tending to happen now, it's shifting more and more to people saying, actually, if I'm a larger building operator, and there's a number of trials starting to happen with consumers' homes in Scotland now, where they put smaller solar installations in combination with a battery in the same facility, so that you optimize the use of your solar generated power locally in your actual building. So if you don't actually consume everything that you're generating at the time, it can be stored. So when it comes into the evening, when it's obviously dark and you can't generate any solar energy yourself, you just draw off the battery for the evening. And that's a trend that's starting. I think that's a difficult one for the energy companies who send you a bill to accept, because you're not pulling so much energy and power off the grid to which they can measure and bill you for. If you've invested in solar and batteries yourself, then it just means that the energy companies are losing in margin on that. but you as a consumer are benefiting. So I think it's a mixture of trials. If it's consumer, if it's industrial and commercial, those are increasingly taking place where local site optimization means that their energy management and their carbon footprint is managed on behalf of a service provider.
Thank you, Jonathan. Another question that was raised was, how big is the flexibility market in the UK in terms of power capacity and size in pounds? Are all referred as ancillary services?
So I haven't got the exact figures off the top of my head, because it's changing pretty much daily, because it's going to be a function of how much storage is available, and that's increasing, and then how much renewable is coming on the market, which is shifting all the time as well. I think at the moment, if you want actual numbers, I think if you look at that government website for the UK, Ofgem, OFGEM, it's got a lot of data they release on the amount of renewable power, the amount of storage. So you can easily get that data. I just don't have it off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
All right, so another question about regulation. What would you say are the challenges in investing in innovation in a market where it is dependent on regulation? Can it be a limiting factor or a scaling factor?
So if I take the UK experience, actually, I think it's really helped that we've got like quasi deregulation, right? There's still government oversight and a watchdog to make sure that the private operators act responsibly, and where it's needed, the government has intervened. So the UK lagged well behind the rest of the world in renewable energy deployment. They then created the Green Investment Bank, which funded a lot of the offshore wind and solar projects. It was so successful that Macquarie Bank ended up buying that, and it continues today. But I don't think it's any different to any other industry. As it suddenly starts to massively change, when it started to become unbundled and private companies and capital started to flood in, as the change happened, it created new problems in the market and issues that needed to be solved, which then triggered and accelerated all this high number of startup companies, whether it was Piccolo and Indra I mentioned, or LimeJump, Upstart, Open Utility, for example. So it stimulated more entrepreneurial activity because it created new problems on the network that needed to be solved, which weren't in government control.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. One more question, a really important question that most likely interests most of our audience here is, who are the entities that Israeli startups should be collaborating with first? Who is more open for innovation?
So I would definitely, what's happened over the last couple of years, it's been the larger energy companies. So Centrica is definitely one. I mean, they own Panoramic Power up in Herzliya. They've still got an investment manager, Dan Moore, based there, he led the investment in Drives, for example, which is the EV charging software company that Centrica's got a stake in. But I would reach out to the larger energy companies, particularly Shell, BP, the Total. They're all trying to enter the power market. And power, I mean, how do you manage electricity generation and transition from renewables? And then the billing companies, so the brands such as British Gas, EDF, etc., who are having to supply consumers and factories and bill them for the amount of energy. Rather on the generation side, it's those where the margins are pretty low. So the more that you can do to help minimize their costs, make sense of all that data that's coming out of people's homes on the smart meters, and the small companies that really use these data-driven metering systems. If you can generate new revenue streams off the back of that data, I think that they would be worth engaging with. So the companies that invoice consumers and factories, as well as the digital companies, which are starting to entrench on that. So Piccolo, for example, as well. I mean, they'd be up for any kind of partnership, or if there's a new tech that they could integrate with, which would allow them to do even more, that would be another place to go.
Thank you, Jonathan. Another question, a follow-up question from the previous one. There's also an interest to hear your thoughts on profitable businesses and business models in the DER residential markets. Are we still 5 years away from EVs, battery storage in the residential market becoming viable?
It's a really good question. There are cases where it can be profitable. And this was my point about the new business models, right? So at the moment, all the earlier stage companies that came onto the market were still trying to get the consumer directly to pay for and purchase a battery, which is going to be several £1,000s, right? If they already had solar, it was maybe an additional benefit they could see, but the uptake's been slow. So this is, I think there's an opportunity here for somebody to figure out, how do you combine infrastructure, finance, where you can lease the battery over a longer period of time with some kind of service that allows the consumer to benefit from that and lower their energy bills. I don't think there's enough evidence yet that says a consumer on the green agenda alone would switch to a battery and be prepared to pay more for their energy. There's an increasing number of consumers that will, but it's not substantial. So that's probably a couple of years away. However, there's a growing number of conversations, certainly I'm having with some of the infrastructure investors who are saying, look, we can get access at scale to very, very low cost financing to finance some of these assets if the business model around leasing and the regulator, so Ofgem as a regulator, will allow 2 or 3 different suppliers of energy to a home. So you might have a different supplier who provides energy for your car, who's different to the people who provide energy for the rest of the home, who's different from the supplier for your battery and your solar purchase agreements. Then I think it could come quicker. But that's not about tech, that's about a business model innovation linked to data. And that's yet to happen. If that happened, then that could happen in the next, it probably could be months away in terms of proposition. But so I don't think it's 5 years away, but it's certainly not here today.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think we have time for one last question. Can you give examples on how investments you have made in Israel, like Panoramic Power that you mentioned before, can create value for the UK grid?
I mean, I don't think the UK is any different to the rest of the world. So if you take things like drives, the reason we did that was when we were at Centrica, we believed the electric vehicle charging infrastructure was going to be like the mobile telephony was back in the early 90s, where it was analog. The people who put the big antennas up also owned the networks and had software to control the antennas, can do all the billing. And then as the market matured, they started to consolidate. There was acquisitions and they became redundancy in the IT layer between the different network operators. We had a hunch that was going to be the same thing happening to EV charging, that you've got in Europe in particular, it's highly fragmented. BP, Shell, Total are starting to acquire some of the local networks. Each time they do another acquisition, they've got another IT system they'd have to integrate, and at some point they'd outsource it. So that was Daron's proposition, to come in and say, look, we think this is how the market's going to go. It'll go to one operating system in the way that it had in the mobile telephony industry, and that's what we've built our platform for. So if you take that kind of approach that Daron did, I would just approach any British company and make that case and say, we think the market's going to evolve like this. This is why we've built our product. This is what it does. Come work with us. I think there's enough openness and interest in innovation around how you can help reduce costs and or open up new income streams, revenue streams from what's happening in the energy transition. You should always be able to get an audience.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. I think that can conclude our event for today. personal thanks to you, Jonathan, and to Ariel and to Eshel, Ignite the Spark for collaborating on this event. We are inviting you to join our festival on UK-Israel Energy, which will take place on March 10th. We're going to distribute the links for registration. It's already here in the chat. Please join us to hear a lot more about what Jonathan just mentioned. And thank you again, everyone. Have a good week and a healthy one. Take care, and we'll hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.